As a capital markets researcher, we are typically used to seeing financial market regulation that puts forth requirements with respect to what firms can disclose, either in periodic filings or in news reports, conference calls, et cetera. So my next question, and I'd love for Stefan to kick us off on this one, is to talk about, why do we have so much regulation when it comes to financial disclosures? That also, misinformation there can definitely have great harm from a financial perspective. But when it comes to platforms like social media platforms, yes, regulation is afoot. However, we see very little or less regulations in that space, where you can say misinformation and disinformation can have a much greater impact when it comes to societal harm. So Stefan, could you share a little bit more about why you think it's been so difficult to regulate, speech or expression on social media platforms versus what we are a lot used to in seeing in the financial markets?
Yeah, thanks, Nerissa. That's a good question. If I were a cynical person, I would say that a lot of very wealthy and powerful people invest money in the markets, and they want their money and their power to be protected, and that's why they come down hard on people who mislead them. You can think about Elizabeth Holmes, who attracted a lot of attention, should we say, and who got a lot of investments this way. So that's the cynical answer, but the cynical answer is never one, I think, that is very constructive. So I'll try a slightly different angle. It took us economic crisis of global proportions several times throughout the 20th century, and a string of Ponzi schemes and frauds, Enron, Bernie Madoff, and all those things, to arrive at the type of restrictive speech environment that we now have when it comes to financial reporting. So we've really learned from a lot of things that went terribly wrong, and we drew the conclusions, the lessons from it, because the fallout was just so devastating. What is still comparatively new by that standard is what we have now with the online environment that social media has created for speech, and the ability that it has to amplify whatever it is that someone wants to put out there. Remember that for most of the 20th century, we were dealing with gatekeepers. Big media corporations, journalists were the gatekeepers to these mass mediums. And yes, they had their problems, but they certainly were mostly not letting complete the insane disinformation onto the front page of the New York Times, barring some exceptions, for instance. That has really changed quite dramatically in the last 20, 30 years or so with the internet and then with social media. So I guess in one way of answering this is to say, well, to ask ourselves, what is the qualitative difference between lying on an annual financial report, lying to your shareholders, and lying to the public about COVID, about elections, and about all these other things? I would say there really isn't that much of a difference, but maybe we haven't, as a society, and I broadly mean societies that live in a democratic representative system that endorses human rights, because if you don't have that, then I think you're already having a very different discussion when it comes to disinformation. But within that context, maybe we just haven't had the massive fallout yet, or maybe it hasn't reached enough people, and this is why I think especially a summit like the one that we have today is so important, because it shines a light on that. Actually, the problem is massive, and maybe the difference is the rationales that we have for restricting speech in financial reporting is actually easily transferable to these other contexts, and maybe that's exactly what you should be doing. That's certainly what I think, and that's certainly, I think, the view that I try to defend in my scholarship.